On January 24, 2023, Patrick Clancy left his home in Duxbury, Massachusetts, to pick up a prescription. His wife, Lindsay, was home with their 3 children, 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 8-month-old Callan. Nothing about the errand suggested that Patrick was about to come home to the worst moment of his life. When he returned, he found Lindsay outside the house, gravely injured after falling from a second-story window. She had survived. Inside the basement, their 3 children were unresponsive. Patrick called 911. "Come quickly," he told the dispatcher. Cora and Dawson were taken to the hospital and pronounced dead that night. Callan was rushed to Boston Children's Hospital. He died 3 days later. 3 children, 1 mother, and a question that would become the center of one of the most difficult criminal cases in Massachusetts history. What had happened while Patrick was gone? Cora Clancy was 5 years old. Dawson was 3. Callan, the youngest, was still an infant, a baby who hadn't yet marked his first birthday. By every account from people who knew the family, they were an ordinary young trio, the kind any parent recognizes. A big sister just old enough to boss her little brothers around, a toddler in the thick of that chaotic, hilarious age, and a baby still being introduced to the world for the first time. They were, in the plainest and most devastating sense, 3 kids who had no idea anything was wrong. Before any of this, the Clancys looked, from the outside, like a family doing everything right. Lindsay had built an entire career around caring for mothers and newborns as a labor and delivery nurse. She had, professionally, sat with countless other women through the most vulnerable days of early motherhood. Patrick worked in medical device sales. They'd settled in Duxbury, a quiet coastal town south of Boston, and within a few years had 3 children under 6. Photos and testimony from before 2022 describe a woman who had wanted this life specifically and enthusiastically. Her own mother, Paula Musgrove, would later testify that motherhood was something Lindsay had always wanted, and that having her children was, in her words, the best thing that ever happened to her. That picture didn't erode over years. By multiple accounts, it started coming apart in a matter of months. The timeline that's emerged in pre-trial filings and trial testimony points to a specific starting point: the birth of Callan, the youngest child, in the summer of 2022. In the months that followed, according to testimony from Lindsay's own mother and other family members, something in her changed in a way none of them recognized. She described feeling like her mind wasn't her own. Family members testified she would tell them, directly, that this wasn't who she really was, that she'd never experienced anything like it before. Her legal team has said, both at her arraignment and throughout pretrial hearings, that she was experiencing severe postpartum mental illness that eventually progressed into psychosis in the months before the killings and was placed on a rapidly shifting, escalating regimen of psychiatric medications, a regimen her attorney and, later, Lindsay and Patrick's own civil lawsuit against her medical providers would characterize as dangerously mismanaged. Whether that medical picture amounted to a woman spiraling toward a recognizable psychiatric emergency, or a woman whose distress never crossed the line into losing touch with reality, is precisely the question this trial exists to answer. Here's the uncomfortable center of this case. The woman who spent her professional life caring for mothers in some of their most vulnerable moments was now living through one. Lindsay Clancy spent years as a labor and delivery nurse, present for other women's most fragile postpartum days. And yet, according to both the defense and, implicitly, the prosecution's own account of a medication history stretching back months, her defense argues that the treatment she received failed to recognize or adequately respond to the severity of what was happening to her. This case forces a question: how does a healthcare system fail to catch, in one of its own, the exact crisis she was trained to watch for in everyone else? To understand January 24th, 2023, you have to sit with what the months before it apparently looked like inside that house. By late 2022, according to testimony from Lindsay's family, she was no longer functioning as herself. Her mother described watching her daughter's apparent slide into what she called darkness and paranoia, not gradual, but disorienting in how quickly it seemed to happen. Prosecutors, for their part, do not dispute that Lindsay was struggling. Their case has never argued she was a well woman. It argues something narrower and, legally, far more consequential, that whatever she was experiencing, she still understood right from wrong on the day it mattered. On the evening of January 24th, prosecutors say Lindsay sent Patrick out on 2 errands: pick up takeout, then stop at CVS for medication for one of the children. Investigators allege she used a mapping app to calculate how long that round trip would take her husband, giving her a defined window. It's one of the single most contested facts in this entire case. To the prosecution, it's the clearest evidence of premeditation they have. To the defense, it's also consistent with something else entirely: the disorganized, compulsive planning that can accompany an active psychotic episode, not necessarily a coldly rational one. Prosecutors allege that in the 25 minutes Patrick Clancy was out of the house, Lindsay used children's exercise resistance bands to strangle Cora, Dawson, and Callan, one after another, in the home's basement. She then, prosecutors and defense agree, attempted to take her own life, cutting her wrists and neck before climbing out a second-story window of the house and falling to the ground below. When Patrick returned home, he found his wife on the ground outside and immediately called 911. As that call continued, he went into the house and discovered his children. His 911 call became one of the trial's most difficult pieces of evidence for jurors to sit through. Lindsay survived the fall, but with catastrophic injuries. She has been paralyzed from roughly the chest down ever since, requires a wheelchair, and has needed round-the-clock medical care. In the years since, she's been held not in a standard jail setting but at Duxbury State Hospital, under court-ordered psychiatric and medical treatment, appearing at early hearings by video from her hospital bed. Prosecutors argue that Lindsay wasn't simply reacting impulsively to a sudden psychiatric episode that day. According to the prosecution's reconstruction, Lindsay waited until Patrick was gone, killed the children, and then attempted to kill herself. To prosecutors, that sequence suggests a deliberate progression. First, remove the obstacle, then carry out the plan, then attempt suicide. But the defense sees the same sequence differently. They argue that the killings and suicide attempt were part of a single psychotic episode rather than a rationally constructed criminal plan. Also, prosecutors pointed to Lindsay's behavior before the killings. Earlier that day, Patrick described her as appearing better than she had been. She spent time with the children. She took Cora to an appointment. She participated in ordinary family activities. To the prosecution, that matters because it suggests she could still function normally, communicate normally, and make decisions normally immediately before the killings. But that's where the defense's argument becomes more complicated, because appearing normal doesn't necessarily mean being mentally well. Family members testified that Lindsay's mental health had deteriorated dramatically after the birth of Callan. She experienced severe anxiety. She became increasingly depressed, and, according to testimony from people close to her, she began expressing thoughts about suicide. That suicidal ideation wasn't simply something the defense introduced after the killings. It had been documented and discussed with family members and healthcare providers before January 24th. Lindsay reportedly struggled to sleep for extended periods, and severe sleep disruption became one of the recurring elements in the defense's reconstruction of her mental decline. For someone already experiencing psychiatric distress, the defense argues, prolonged insomnia could have pushed her further toward a psychiatric crisis. In January 2023, Lindsay voluntarily admitted herself to McLean Hospital for psychiatric treatment. Her deterioration had become serious enough that she sought psychiatric treatment herself. And this is where the case becomes especially complicated, because the hospitalization can be interpreted in two completely different ways. For the defense, it is evidence that Lindsay was seriously unwell and actively seeking help. For the prosecution, the observations made by clinicians during that hospitalization are evidence that she was severely depressed, but not psychotic. In the months before the killings, Lindsay's psychiatric medications changed repeatedly. The defense has argued that she was placed on a complicated and rapidly changing combination of medications and that her treatment was poorly managed. That allegation also became part of Patrick's later civil lawsuit against members of Lindsay's healthcare team. The prosecution, however, has challenged the idea that medication problems explain what happened. And again, the jury has to separate two things: what medications Lindsay was taking and whether those medications caused or contributed to her mental state. Lindsay's relatives described a woman who seemed increasingly unlike herself. They saw changes in her mood. They heard her describe frightening thoughts. They watched her struggle. And some testified that she repeatedly asked family members to stay with her because she was afraid to be alone. Those observations don't automatically establish psychosis, but they help establish something neither side seriously disputes. Lindsay was deteriorating. The disagreement is about how far that deterioration had gone. And then comes one of the most important pieces of the defense case: the alleged hallucinations. Lindsay later told clinicians that she had heard a male voice commanding her to kill her children and then herself. Defense experts have interpreted this as evidence of a command hallucination associated with psychosis. But prosecutors have challenged the reliability and timing of those reports, particularly because the alleged voice was not consistently documented in contemporaneous medical records. So once again, the same piece of evidence points in two directions. To the defense, it is a symptom of psychosis. To the prosecution, it is an account that must be examined carefully because it emerged after the killings. The defense forensic psychiatrist Dr. Philip Resnick described what he believed were command hallucinations and a delusion of influence, a belief that an external force was controlling her actions. The prosecution's psychiatric experts reached a fundamentally different conclusion. They agreed Lindsay was seriously mentally ill, but they did not believe she had crossed the legal threshold for lack of criminal responsibility. And that distinction is crucial. She was formally arraigned in October 2023 on 3 counts of murder and related strangulation charges. She pleaded not guilty. Her trial, delayed repeatedly, first from December 2025, then February 2026, then further still, finally began with jury selection in Plymouth Superior Court in late July 2026 before Judge William F. Sullivan. This is not a case about whether Lindsay Clancy caused her children's deaths. The defense does not dispute that. The dispute is whether she was criminally responsible for what she did. It's a case entirely about her state of mind, which means almost every piece of evidence in this trial has to be interpreted twice. Once as evidence of what happened, and once as evidence of whether she understood what was happening while it happened. Take the mapping app detail. Prosecutor Jennifer Sprague, representing the Plymouth County District Attorney's Office, has argued this shows deliberate premeditation. A woman clear-headed enough to calculate a window of opportunity and use it with precision. But defense witnesses, including forensic psychiatrist Dr. Philip Resnick, testified that psychotic episodes don't necessarily eliminate a person's ability to plan. They distort the reasoning behind the plan, not always the mechanics of carrying it out. Resnick, who interviewed Clancy roughly 4 months after the killings and spent hours with her and her parents, testified that on that specific day, she was experiencing what's known clinically as a command hallucination, alongside a delusion of influence, a sensation, he said, of her body being controlled by something outside herself. He also testified that psychosis can fluctuate within a single day, meaning she may not have been equally impaired every minute of that evening. Investigators, meanwhile, pointed to a detail that cuts the opposite direction: a search on Lindsay's phone, made before the killings, asking whether a sociopath can be treated. Prosecutors have used that search to suggest self-awareness and premeditated intent. The defense has argued it's equally consistent with a terrified, deteriorating woman trying to understand what was happening to her own mind. Then there's the testimony of a hospital chaplain, who told the court that in the aftermath, Lindsay said she was glad her children were now safe. A statement prosecutors have leaned on hard, arguing it reflects a disturbing but lucid rationale rather than a break from reality. The defense's rebuttal is that this kind of statement, however chilling it sounds outside clinical context, is also a documented feature of severe postpartum psychosis, in which a parent can become genuinely convinced, in a delusional state, that their children are in mortal danger and that death is a form of protection. The prosecution's own rebuttal psychiatrist, Dr. Avram Mack, interviewed Clancy in April 2026 and testified for the state's side, agreeing she was suffering from severe mental illness, but drawing a legal distinction the jury will have to weigh carefully: that her illness, in his assessment, was a continuation of a depression she'd experienced for months, one severe enough to be devastating but not, in his view, severe enough to have eliminated her capacity to distinguish right from wrong at the moment she acted. That distinction, not whether she was sick, but whether her sickness crossed a specific legal threshold, is the entire trial in a single sentence. Because Massachusetts law treats "not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility" as an affirmative defense, the burden here runs differently than in most murder trials. Clancy's attorney, Kevin Reddington, doesn't need to convince the jury she didn't do it. He needs to convince them that whatever she did, she should not be held criminally responsible for it. That severe postpartum psychosis, compounded by what her legal team and a related civil lawsuit describe as dangerously mismanaged psychiatric medication, had already taken her capacity for rational judgment away from her before that January evening began. The prosecution's case, laid out over multiple weeks, leaned heavily on the mapping app timeline. The phone search, the chaplain's testimony, and expert analysis arguing Clancy retained the capacity to know right from wrong. The defense, calling 10 witnesses including Lindsay's own mother and 2 forensic psychiatrists, built a case around her rapid, visible deterioration in the months after Callan's birth, and expert testimony that she was actively psychotic, not merely depressed, on the day her children died. The defense formally rested on August 21, 2026, after Dr. Resnick's testimony that Clancy was, in his clinical opinion, clearly psychotic that day. Prosecutors immediately began calling rebuttal witnesses. As of August 25, the prosecution is still presenting its final rebuttal testimony. Prosecution forensic psychologist Dr. Kirk Halbrin testified that, in his opinion, Lindsay retained moral awareness and control when she killed her children and remained criminally responsible. Closing arguments have not yet taken place, and the jury has not begun deliberating. If convicted of murder, Lindsay Clancy could face life in prison. If the jury instead finds she was not criminally responsible for her actions, Massachusetts law would likely route her not to prison, but into the custody of the state's mental health system for treatment. A courtroom outcome that would look and mean something very different from a conviction. Neither outcome has happened yet. This is, as of today, a case without an ending. Whatever the jury eventually decides about Lindsay Clancy's mental state, it will not change the fact sitting underneath every hour of expert testimony and legal argument. Cora, Dawson, and Callan Clancy are gone. A 5-year-old who was just old enough to have a personality all her own. A 3-year-old in the middle of learning who he was. An 8-month-old baby whose life had barely begun. No verdict, in either direction, gives any of that back. The legal question this trial is built to answer, was their mother criminally responsible, is a genuinely important one. It is also, for the 3 children at the center of it, entirely beside the point. Patrick Clancy, in the years since, has said publicly that he doesn't see the wife he married as a monster, that he sees a woman who, in his words, got sick. It's a wrenching position for a father to hold, but whether the machinery of her mind was working well enough on one evening in January for the law to hold her fully responsible for what it did. That's the real fault line this case sits on, not innocence versus guilt in the way most true crime stories frame it, but the much harder question of where a person ends and an illness begins, and whether the legal system has any clean way of drawing that line at all. There is no verdict yet, no sentence, no commitment order, no final chapter to hand you. What there is, right now, is a woman in a wheelchair who will likely never walk again, a husband who lost 3 children, and a marriage in a single evening. Until then, the only thing everyone in that courtroom agrees on is the part that was never actually in question. Cora, Dawson, and Callan Clancy should still be here. If you found this story touching, please consider sharing it with someone else. And if you haven't already, subscribe. It helps us continue telling the stories that deserve to be remembered, not for the crimes that ended them, but for the lives that came before. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.